One of the issues that is really worrying many bond investors is that governments have such big debts these days, they're going to have to sell a lot of bonds in the future to simply plug that hole. So I asked Hugh Hendry why that didn't make him concerned about the outlook for government bond prices.
I find it remarkable that people even posit the question. I find it remarkable because we are surrounded with enormous and immediate precedent which suggests it's not an issue. The precedent is Japan. When Japan hit the turbulence which we're experiencing now, but when they hit it 20 years ago, their public finances were very similar to the finances we had in the UK going back a year or so in the US, where gross public debt was no more than 40% of GDP. Now, over the last 20 years, the Japanese have fought crisis after crisis by expanding the public sector debt. Yeah? And they've issued trillions, literally trillions of yen. And debt is now approaching 200% of GDP. What's happened to government bond yields? They've gone down. You know, the old French historian from the 18th century says law, supply creates its demand. There is a need for this intervention because the economy is slowing down, and it's slowing down because the private sector is raising its savings levels. So the available pool to buy the damn bonds, if you will, is escalating. And the other point is, no one owns them. If you go back in history and you look at what banks, commercial banks used to own in the government bond market, if you look at what pension funds used to own in government bond markets and mutual funds, no one owns them. No one owns them. So we only have to go back to the averages of the last 40 or 50 years, and you can supply, you can meet the supply.
And yet, of course, the crucial difference between Japan and other countries like the UK or US is that in Japan, 95% of the JGB market is owned domestically by institutions that are often under the quasi-political control of the government. In the US, we have, 50% of the outstanding issuance is non-US owned. Now, do you not think there is a risk that the external creditors to the US will start to panic at some point, or the external creditors to the UK? Because we have a similar pattern here in London.
I would say to you, they have panicked. Yeah, here we are with the most profound collapse in world industrial production, world trade since the 1930s. That is not an exaggeration, that is reality. Okay? And yet today, as I said to you, bond yields have tightened considerably. Monetary policy. The Fed has withdrawn, and indeed the Bank of England has withdrawn from the activity of establishing interest rates. Interest rates are zero, and they have no ambition to change that. It's the private sector and all of our fears which now govern the activities of economies. And what I want to suggest to you is that I believe it would be ironic, but it's a possibility that history will look upon this year and say that the Bernankes of this world, they got it. They got and believe me, I'm not one that typically is on the case of promoting the Federal Reserve, but far from it, but they got the severity. They saw the need to create and be a force against this contraction by the private sector. But they were stymied in the ambition of their efforts by almost this hysterical reaction from fabled investors such as Warren Buffett, Bill Gross, from Angela Merkel, from the governor of the Bank of China, from gold being at $1,000, and from a fear that the dollar would collapse. And so knowing all of this, that they only proposed to grow the money supply at the rate which is expanding just now. It's expanding at like 9% just now. It's 26% in China. We don't talk about that, but we might come back to that. I think their steps, history will determine that their steps were modest, and they were massively overwhelmed by this hysteria which raised interest rates. So this happened, remember, in 1931. In 1931, the 10-year bond yield rose from 3.7 to 4.4, so it went back to the prevailing average of the previous 10 years. And it brought with it calamity. It brought with it a tremendous contraction in the economy. That remains a possibility as I look ahead over the next 12 months.